underneath the ink-stained sky of Manhattan, where city lights danced like restless stars. Richard White stood motionless in the glass-encased penthouse of the WhiteTech Tower. 80 floors above the city that never slept, he looked out over the skyline he once fought so hard to conquer. Now, it all felt like a battlefield long abandoned. At 37, Richard was the embodiment of power, sharp-jawed, steel-eyed, and always dressed like success had been tailored onto him. Forbes had labeled him America's mind of the future. Wall Street worshipped his instinct. But none of it could silence the storm that lived inside his chest. The wind howled gently against the floor-to-ceiling windows, but it was nothing compared to the silence within. A silence that had grown unbearable since that winter evening 3 years ago, when everything changed. On his desk lay a crystal tumbler, half filled with untouched whiskey, and beside it, a manila envelope, so worn its edges had curled like old leaves. Richard's fingers brushed over it, hesitant, reverent. He didn't need to open it. He had memorized every word, every cruel syllable printed inside. The patient is infertile. 3 words. 3 bullets that shattered his dreams of legacy and bloodline. He remembered the sterile smell of the doctor's office, the cold voice that delivered the diagnosis like a weather forecast. There's no cure, no warmth, no room for hope. He had built everything. WhiteTech, global influence, a penthouse above the clouds, not just to escape the poverty of his past, but to someday share it with a family, with her. Claire. Claire had been his anchor, his light, his wife, the woman who challenged his ambition and matched him stride for stride. They'd talked about children, family trips, late Sunday mornings tangled in laughter and pancakes. And then one day, her breath faltered, her smile faded. A failing heart stole her from him faster than success had ever arrived. And when she left, she took the last thread of belief that Richard was destined for more than numbers. Tonight, like many nights before, he had returned to this glass cage to think, to ache, to remember. A man who once built empires now stood powerless before a past he couldn't rewrite. He walked toward the balcony, stepping into the October chill. The cold bit into his skin, reminding him that he was alive. Barely. From somewhere in the building's lower floors, a faint melody floated upward. A voice. Soft, untrained, but hauntingly beautiful. It slipped through the air like smoke. Fragile, impossible to catch, yet impossible to ignore. Richard frowned. The building should have been empty, except for overnight security and janitorial staff. But the song, a mournful tune that echoed something ancient and aching, felt like it wasn't meant to be heard. At least, not by him. He closed his eyes, and he didn't think of Claire for the first time in months, or the envelope, or the boardroom battles waiting tomorrow. All he heard was that voice, that song, and something in him stirred, faint, flickering, like a street lamp in fog. Maybe fate was sending him a message, or perhaps he was finally losing his mind. But either way, Richard White was no longer alone in the dark. Sometimes, the quietest voices reach the hearts screaming the loudest. If you feel the stirrings of something powerful in this story, comment below with your thoughts, and follow the channel for the next chapter in Richard and Susan's extraordinary journey. This is only the beginning, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. 10 floors below Richard White's glass sanctuary, a different world unfolded, one far removed from wealth, marble, and power. It was close to 2:30 in the morning, and the polished corridors of WhiteTech were bathed in a soft, bluish glow from emergency lights. Most floors were lifeless at this hour. save for the gentle hum of machines in sleep mode and the occasional flicker of motion sensors detecting silence. But on the 10th floor, the night was not entirely still. Susan Robinson crept, her broom sliding across the marble floor in measured strokes. Her navy blue uniform, functional and faintly dusted with lint, hung loose on her slender frame. Her dark brown skin shimmered under the soft lights, and her coiled hair, tightly pinned back, revealed the faint silver scar just below her jawline, evidence of a childhood fall from a rusted fire escape. Her voice, low, velvety, and unwavering, carried another song, a folk tune, slow and steady. Her mother passed down one in the kitchen of a Harlem apartment where warmth had nothing to do with central heating. "Follow the drinking gourd," she sang, her tone barely louder than the whisper of her broom. The melody wrapped around the empty hallway like an old quilt, worn, imperfect, but comforting. Susan did not sing to be heard. She sang because silence had always felt too heavy. At 26, she had lived through more than most. Her mother, Lena, had been the heart of her world, a woman who made cornbread from scratch and courage out of scraps. When Lena died from breast cancer, Susan was just 16, and the responsibility of raising her younger brother, Jamal, fell onto her narrow shoulders. College had been a dream. Cleaning floors became a reality. Each night, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Susan polished the dreams of others. Shiny boardrooms, executive lounges, glass surfaces that reflected a life she would never touch. And yet, there was no bitterness in her, only a quiet resolve. She sent most of her wages to Jamal, who is now in his final year at Howard University, studying engineering. He was the dream she chose to keep alive. Her dreams were quieter, folded into pages of a second-hand poetry book tucked inside her cleaning cart. When exhaustion set in, she read Langston Hughes beneath stairwells, imagining a world where poor children in Harlem learned to paint, sing, and feel safe. But such things felt far away, far above. So instead, she sang. She sang when her back ached. She sang when the vending machine ate her last dollar. She sang when tears threatened to rise, but had no permission to fall. Tonight, her voice flowed with a little more weight. Not sadness, not quite. Something heavier, something ancient. What she did not know, what she could not have imagined, was that her voice, that quiet current of sorrow and strength, had traveled upward through concrete and steel, and found ears that hadn't truly listened in years. Richard White had heard her, and somewhere, 8 floors above, something inside him had shifted. But Susan remained unaware. She wiped her brow and glanced toward the expansive windows framing the city. Lights flickered like stars, but none belonged to her. In her world, stars were promises kept for other people. She leaned against her broom for a moment, thinking of Jamal's voice on the phone last week, bursting with excitement over a robotics project. "I'm gonna make you proud, Susan," he'd said. And she had smiled, swallowing tears, replying, "You already have." But after she hung up, she sat alone at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea, wondering if her sacrifices would ever be enough. Would anyone ever look at her, truly see her, not as a janitor or someone who had to survive, but as someone who mattered? Her voice rose again, clearer this time, tinged with defiance. Not for an audience, not for comfort, but for herself. Susan didn't know the answer, but she knew how to keep going, and she did not yet see the figure standing at the far end of the hallway. Richard had taken the private executive elevator without thinking, guided only by that melody, that voice. He hadn't planned to speak and hadn't even planned to stop. But when he saw her alone, singing to the quiet, The cold walls he had carefully built began to tremble. She was unlike anything in his world. No curated polish, no boardroom script, no hidden agenda. Just a woman, working through the night, humming a song older than his tower. He didn't know her name, but he couldn't look away. And she still hadn't seen him. Not yet. The soft bristles of Susan's broom whispered against the marble floor as she reached the end of the corridor. Her song tapered off naturally, dissolving into the quiet hum of fluorescent lights overhead. She leaned slightly into the broom handle and stretched her shoulders, unaware she was no longer alone. Richard stood about 15 feet behind her, silent as snowfall. For a moment, he watched. He didn't know what he was waiting for. Perhaps a sign that this encounter was meant to happen. Maybe just the courage to speak. All he knew was that his heartbeat, usually steady as a ticking clock, now stuttered with something unfamiliar. Then, as if feeling his presence in the air, Susan turned. She startled. Her eyes, large, dark, and intelligent, widened with shock. Her grip tightened on the broom. The soft hum of the building fell away as silence swallowed them whole. She knew who he was instantly. Everyone at WhiteTech did. Richard White, CEO, billionaire, a name that existed in headlines and corporate emails, never in the dim-lit hallway of a night shift janitor. He was the man whose company name gleamed on every door, whose presence was more myth than man. She had never expected to see him here. Her voice caught before it could escape her lips. I'm sorry, she managed, stepping back instinctively, brushing her uniform as if erasing evidence of her existence. But Richard raised a hand gently, his expression neither stern nor irritated. "No need to apologize," he said, his voice lower than she expected, as if unfamiliar with speaking softly. Susan blinked. Her mind raced. Did she break a rule? Was she not supposed to sing? Would this cost her the job? "I didn't mean to disturb anyone. I didn't realize anyone else was here," she said quickly, her tone composed, but her fingers betraying her nervousness as they twisted around the broom handle. "You didn't disturb me," Richard replied. Quite the opposite. His gaze was steady, yet not invasive. Curious, perhaps, and somehow kind. Susan frowned slightly, unsure what to make of this surreal moment. She was used to invisibility. People in suits passed her every night without so much as a glance. She existed in the margins of the building's schedule, cleaning when no one looked, disappearing before they returned. But now she was seen. "What's the song?" Richard asked, tilting his head slightly. "I heard it from upstairs." She hesitated, then answered, "It's called Follow the Drinking Gourd, an old spiritual my mother used to sing." Her voice was softer now, touched with memory. She said it reminded her to keep going, even in the dark. Richard didn't move, but something in him shifted. Keep going, even in the dark. The words hung in the air like poetry, too weighty for coincidence. "Your mother must have been a remarkable woman," he murmured. "She was," Susan replied, her shoulders relaxing just a little. "She taught me how to find light when the world offers none." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full. And for the first time, Susan noticed something in Richard's eyes that surprised her. Not the cold sharpness she'd expected from someone of his stature, but weariness. The kind that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying something unseen for too long. It made him seem human. She breathed, glancing down at her broom, suddenly conscious of the space between them. She was still in uniform. He was still the man at the top of the building, of the world. "I should get back to work," she said, not coldly, just cautiously. But as she turned, Richard spoke again, hesitant this time. "There's a cafe around the corner," he said. "Open all night. They serve terrible coffee, but it's warm." Susan stopped. Her hand froze mid-reach for the cart. She didn't turn. "I didn't mean to make things awkward," he added. "I just haven't heard something that real in a long time." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she turned to face him. "Are you always this direct with your employees, Mr. White?" The faintest smile touched his lips. "Only when I'm not sure what else to say." Susan looked at him, really looked. And despite everything, status, uniform, time, and doubt, something in her softened. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, not like someone beneath him, but like someone worth hearing. Perhaps it was the exhaustion in both of them, or it was curiosity, cloaked in coffee and caution. She nodded. "1 cup," she said. And as they stepped into the elevator together, he in his unbuttoned dress shirt, and she still dusted with lint from the floor they'd just left, neither of them knew that this simple act would unravel everything they thought they knew about life, love, and the walls that separated their worlds. The small cafe on the corner of Lexington and 53rd wasn't known for much. Its coffee was bitter, its lighting too dim, and the cracked leather booths had long surrendered their elegance. But that night, under its weary amber glow, the space felt like a pocket of stillness carved out from the chaos of Manhattan. Susan Robinson sat across from Richard White in the farthest booth, her hands wrapped tightly around a ceramic mug, as though trying to warm herself from the inside out. She wore her navy uniform, the hem slightly damp from walking through the misty streets. A single stray thread clung to her shoulder. Flushed from the walk, her cheeks bore no makeup, just raw, clean exhaustion. Yet in that fatigue, there was an honesty no high-rise boardroom could replicate. Richard, for his part, looked entirely out of place. Though now rumpled at the cuffs, his white dress shirt still bore the crispness of someone unused to lingering in public spaces without purpose. But he sat with an unusual ease, his coat draped over the seat beside him, his phone face down on the table. They were alone in the booth, but not in the room. An older man read a newspaper in the corner. A college student dozed off on her laptop. A waitress refilled a sugar jar nearby. Still, the world outside the booth seemed impossibly far away. "I don't usually do this," Susan said after a stretch of silence, her fingers still circling the coffee cup. "Talk to strangers, especially not strangers with Forbes profiles." Richard gave a soft chuckle, his voice low and smooth. "That makes 2 of us, though I suspect the coffee's better when you're not drinking it alone." She glanced up at him, wary, but not unkind. "So, why were you on the 10th floor at that hour?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted to the window beside them, where raindrops traced slow, thoughtful patterns on the glass. "Couldn't sleep," he said finally. "Lately, I haven't slept much. The office feels less empty than my apartment." There was no bravado in his words, no performance, just a quiet truth. Susan studied him for a moment. She hadn't expected vulnerability, not from him. But it wasn't feigned. It clung to him like his shadow, subtle but undeniable. She sipped her coffee. It wasn't perfect, just as he'd promised. "My mother used to say that the night doesn't lie," she said softly. "It's the only time the world stops pretending." Richard nodded, his gaze returning to her. "She sounds like she was wise." "She was," Susan said, a small smile tugging at her lips, and loud and stubborn and wonderful. He smiled too, gently, as though the image of her mother had come to life between them. "What happened to her?" he asked, his tone cautious, not wanting to intrude but unable to hold back. breast cancer. When I was 16. She said it with the ease of someone who had long since accepted that pain would never leave, only settle into the background like furniture. I had to leave college, she continued. My brother Jamal was just 10. Someone had to keep the lights on. So I cleaned. First homes, then hotels. Now here. Richard's eyes softened, but he didn't pity her. That, Susan noticed, and appreciated. You gave up your dreams for him. I didn't give them up, she said, straightening a little. I just put them on layaway. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. And what are those dreams? The question hung there, more dangerous than either of them realized. She said she wanted to open a community center in Harlem for kids like Jamal, somewhere they can paint, write, and sing, exist without fear. There was no trace of apology in her voice, only quiet conviction. Richard exhaled, almost as if he'd been holding his breath. You still believe in things like that? Don't you? She asked, tilting her head. He paused, then smiled with a kind of sad wonder. I used to. Their eyes met again, and this time, neither looked away. The waitress passed by and left the check without a word. Susan reached for it instinctively, but Richard placed his hand over hers, not possessively, just gently. I invited you, he said. Susan hesitated, then withdrew her hand. She didn't argue. As they stepped back into the drizzle, the neon lights from the diner blurred into soft watercolors on the sidewalk. Cars hissed through puddles. The air smelled like steel and rain. They walked silently for a few steps until they reached the tower's lobby. Susan turned toward the elevator reserved for staff, while Richard paused, uncertain. Will I hear you sing again? He asked. She looked at him, her face unreadable, then gave the faintest shrug. If the hallway's empty, she said, and the mood's right, maybe. The elevator doors opened behind her, and just before stepping in, she looked over her shoulder and added, but only if you're listening. Richard stood at the threshold of the lobby long after she disappeared behind the steel doors, the echo of her voice somehow more present than silence itself. That night, sleep did not come easily for him. But when it did, he dreamed, not of loss, numbers, or power, but of a voice soft enough to bend steel and strong enough to reach a man 80 floors above the ground. The next night, Susan told herself it had meant nothing. The coffee, the walk, the unexpected softness in Richard's eyes. She tried to chalk it up to fatigue, to the strange pull of night hours when reality seems more flexible. But as she buttoned her uniform in her tiny apartment, 1 room, 2 windows, and a sink that leaked every other week, she hesitated at the mirror. Something was different. She still tied her hair the same way, still tucked her scar behind her collar. Still, she walked the same 3 blocks past the bakery she couldn't afford, but her chest felt lighter. Her steps were quieter, but not from weariness. She was humming again, and it wasn't just for survival. On the 10th floor that night, she swept slowly, expecting, perhaps hoping, that he might appear again. But Richard White did not come. Instead, there was a folded piece of paper in the break room. No envelope, no name. A single sheet was placed beneath a slightly warm croissant on a napkin that read, "The River Café." Susan stared at it for a moment, wary. Then she picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was careful, like someone not used to writing by hand. I don't know why your voice stayed with me all night. Maybe because it wasn't asking for anything. It could be because it reminded me what honesty sounds like. Thank you for the music and the silence in between. R. Susan held the note for a long while. Then slowly, she broke the croissant in half and ate it at the corner of the hallway window, where the skyline flickered like an unreachable constellation. She didn't tell anyone, didn't even admit to herself how it made her feel. But the next night, after her shift, she left something behind, in the same break room, folded carefully. Sometimes, the silence between verses is the part that lingers the longest. Thank you for hearing it. S. No name, just a letter, like his. And so it began. An unspoken ritual. Nights turned into weeks. They didn't always see each other, but left pieces of themselves behind. Fragments in handwriting, corners of poetry, the warmth of a paper cup left on the table. He left a book by Langston Hughes. Inside, a pencil line is underlined. Hold fast to dreams. If dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly. She responded with a napkin sketch of a bird mid-flight. He left a blueberry muffin with a sticky note. For long nights. She scribbled back. You make them feel shorter. Their worlds still didn't touch. He wore suits. She wore sneakers with worn soles. He stood in boardrooms. She walked beneath them. But the space between them no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a thread. Susan found herself smiling at strange hours. She kept a small notebook in her cart in case she thought of something worth sharing. She told herself it was just words, just a kind of friendship. But sometimes, when she stood by the windows at 3 a.m., she wondered what it would be like to see her reflection in his world, not as an echo, not as an accident, but as someone who mattered. Richard, too, noticed the change. During meetings, his mind wandered. He stared at the 10th floor's camera feeds, not obsessively, but quietly, as though waiting to glimpse something rare and real. He'd once been a man who saw every minute as an opportunity cost. But now, time felt different, less measured, more human. His assistant noticed. So did the board. He brushed off their questions with carefully placed distractions. No one knew about Susan. Not yet. He wanted to keep her safe, to protect whatever fragile truth was growing between them. One night, just after midnight, he sent a message to the security team to turn off cameras on the 10th floor. System maintenance, he wrote. No one questioned him. And at 12:30 a.m., he stepped off the executive elevator once more. Susan was there, by the same window, her cart nearby, a poetry book resting on top. She didn't startle this time. She turned slowly, as though expecting him. I was wondering, she said, voice calm but cautious, if you'd stopped writing. He smiled. I wanted to say it in person. She looked at him for a long moment. You're not what I expected, she said finally. I hope that's a good thing. I haven't decided yet. He chuckled softly, then nodded at the book. Favorite poem tonight? She handed it to him, open to a dog-eared page. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. Richard read it aloud, voice low and reverent. The words hung between them like sacred air. He looked up. It's beautiful. Susan nodded. It's a truth that's still waiting to be heard. And as they stood there, in the quiet heartbeat of the building, with glass and city lights surrounding them like stars in an artificial sky, something unspoken passed between them. Not a confession, not yet, but a recognition. Two lives, once parallel, had begun, slowly, delicately, to lean toward each other, not out of need, but out of something more daring, possibility. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed. Susan had known it in her mind, like a draft sneaking under a closed door. But when it happened, when the whispers began, she hadn't expected it to feel so sharp. At first, it was nothing more than glances. Two co-workers, both janitorial staff like her, paused their sweeping one night as she passed through the 10th floor. They didn't say anything, just exchanged a look, but Susan felt it in her spine. Then came the intentional and sudden silence whenever she entered the break room. And finally, one evening, a voice behind her. "So, you still sing for your billionaire?" Susan froze. She turned slowly to see Tanya, a former friend who had once shared late-night laughs with her over vending machine coffee. Tanya's arms were folded tightly across her chest, her gaze cool, unforgiving. Susan met her stare. "Excuse me?" Tanya shrugged, lips twitching with something between pity and disdain. "You know how people talk. You disappear during shifts. Notes keep showing up. You think folks don't notice?" "I mind my business, Tanya," Susan said quietly. "You should too. But it's not your business anymore," Tanya said, voice low, sharp. "Not when you're having coffee dates with the man who signs our paychecks." Susan walked away without responding. She told herself it didn't matter, but her hands trembled the next time she picked up her broom. That night, she didn't sing. Richard White dealt with his version of the fallout on the top floor. The call came just past noon, while he reviewed product data with his COO, Charles Wakefield. "Richard," Charles said, laying his phone flat on the table. "I need to ask, do you see someone who works here?" Richard didn't look up. "Why?" "Because rumors are leaking, and not just on Slack channels. There's a gossip piece being drafted. CEO and the janitor. Catchy." Richard's jaw tightened. "Is that what this is about? Optics?" Charles leaned forward. "It's about the board, investors, public perception. You're the face of this company. Dating a subordinate." "She's not a subordinate," Richard snapped, more sharply than he intended. Charles blinked. "Okay," he said, voice slower now. "Then what is she?" Richard didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because he wasn't ready to discuss her name. For dissection. Charles sighed. "Look, I'm not here to judge, but you need to know. This won't stay private much longer. And when it becomes public, it won't be fair to her." Richard nodded slowly. "I know. But knowing didn't make it easier." That evening, Susan avoided the 10th floor altogether. She took her breaks early, kept to herself, and didn't leave any notes behind. She told herself it was just for one night, but on the second night, Richard was there, waiting in the quiet corridor, leaning against the window where she usually stood. She stopped when she saw him, broom in hand, shoulders tense. "I'm sorry," she said before he could speak. "For what?" "For being reckless," she replied. "For making you vulnerable. For making me—" She paused, then shifted. "I didn't mean for any of this to get out." "It wasn't you," Richard said calmly. "And it wasn't me. It was the world." Susan lowered her gaze. "They think I'm a joke." "No," he said firmly. "They're afraid of what they don't understand." She looked up, eyes gleaming but dry. "Do you understand this?" He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking to breath. "I don't know what this is yet," he admitted, "but I know it's real." Susan didn't speak. She couldn't. Her throat ached with restraint. Richard reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper. He held it between them. "I was going to leave this where I usually do," he said, "but I'd rather say it." He unfolded the paper and read aloud. "I don't know if what we're building can survive beyond these walls, but I'd rather build it and risk it falling than never try." The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was charged, aching with all the things that couldn't yet be named. Susan stepped back, her voice quiet but resolute. "Then you should know. If you keep walking toward me, You'll have to face what they say, what they assume, what they'll never let go. Richard took one step closer. Then let them talk, he said softly. But let me choose to stand here with you. The words didn't fix anything. They didn't erase the whispers, glances, or headlines waiting to be written. But they anchored something more substantial than the noise. Later that night, as Susan swept the hallway alone, she found a note tucked behind the tea box in the break room drawer. This time, no poetry, just a single sentence. You are the one real thing I have left. R. She folded it slowly and slipped it into the front pocket of her uniform, close to her heart. Outside, the city moved like a river, but inside, something fragile, defiant, and deeply human was beginning to hold. Autumn deepened its hold on New York City. The leaves that had once clung with fire-colored stubbornness to the trees along Central Park now littered the sidewalks in quiet surrender. The nights grew colder, not yet bitter, but enough to leave a trace on skin and breath. And inside the towering glass skeleton of WhiteTech, two people still met beneath the flicker of unseen moments. For Susan, each shift became more complicated. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they had gained texture. Now they carried tone, suspicion, envy, even cruelty. Her breaks had become shorter. Her voice stayed buried in her chest. And still, she worked. It was easier than explaining. She kept her head down, but her heart had a different rhythm. It brought to mind paper notes tucked into tea tins, unexpected laughter in stairwells, and eyes that held space for her even when the world didn't. She tried to remind herself this wasn't real. Couldn't be. But it was. Every night, it was. And then one evening, everything shifted again. Richard waited for her in the hidden garden behind the tower. It was a strange place, an architectural afterthought created during the building's initial zoning approval. Tucked between two wings of glass and steel, the garden rarely saw visitors. A handful of benches, a few lavender bushes defying the chill, and a single antique lamppost that flickered as though unsure of its purpose. Susan arrived, wrapped in her oversized work coat, her breath fogging the air. She spotted him immediately, sitting on a bench with his hands tucked into his pockets, his head tilted toward the sky as if searching for stars. "I didn't think this place existed," she said softly as she approached. He looked at her and smiled. "Neither did I. Until I needed to find somewhere I could breathe." She sat beside him, the space between them small but distinct. For a while, they didn't speak. The quiet was not awkward, but sacred, like a breath held between heartbeats. Then Richard asked, "Did you ever think we'd end up here? Not just this place, but this?" Susan shook her head. "I didn't even think you'd remember my name." "I remember everything," he said. "Your voice, the way you stand when you're thinking. The poem you left is about silence." She laughed, soft and dry. "You're observant of a man who built his empire by ignoring everything but numbers." "That's the thing," he said, turning to face her fully. "The numbers never saw me again." Susan looked at him then, not as the man who owned the building she cleaned, but as someone unraveling slowly before her. "Claire," he said quietly. The name hung between them like a ghost. "My wife," he added. "She passed away 3 years ago from heart failure. We were planning a trip to Paris, and then, just like that." He stopped. His breath caught. "I'm sorry," Susan whispered, and meant it. He murmured, "I haven't said her name out loud in a long time. Not because I forgot, but I didn't think I had the right to repeat it. Not if I was starting to feel something else." Susan's breath slowed. He wasn't just admitting grief. He was admitting change, and she wasn't sure which frightened her more. "I don't want to replace anyone, Richard," she said gently. He looked at her, eyes quiet. "You're not replacing her. You're reminding me that I'm still alive." The wind stirred around them. Susan crossed her arms against the chill, and Richard shrugged off his coat, draping it over her shoulders without hesitation. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed her. "I know," he replied. "But let me do this anyway." They sat in silence again, and then, almost imperceptibly, she said, "My mother died when I was 16. I still hear her voice when I'm afraid." He didn't ask what she meant. He just waited. "She used to tell me I was meant for more," Susan continued. "More than Harlem rooftops and janitor uniforms. But after she passed, I had to choose, my brother or I. You chose him." "I still do," she said, "every day." Richard looked at her with something that bordered on reverence. "Do you ever wish it had been different?" She turned her face toward him every day. He nodded slowly. "But I don't regret it," she added. "Not 1 second." The moon slipped out from behind a passing cloud, casting its silver light over them. Richard reached for her hand, tentatively, like someone touching a fragile truth, and she let him. Her fingers were cold. His were steady. "I don't know what this is," she whispered. "Me neither," he replied. "But I know I don't want it to end." She looked down at their joined hands. "The world won't make this easy." "I'm not asking for easy," he said. "I'm asking for the truth." She swallowed, unsure of how to reply. But her grip tightened slightly. That was answer enough, and in the pale hush of night, beneath the branches of lavender too stubborn to die, Richard leaned closer. There was no rush, no demand. Just a question, spoken not with words, but with stillness. And when his lips finally met hers, it was less an explosion and more a quiet unfolding. A letting go, a letting in. Her heart stuttered. He finally found rhythm. It was not a kiss of fire, it was a kiss of promise. And even as they pulled apart, breath mingling in the air, both of them knew the world was waiting with teeth and judgment. But for now, they had carved out one moment of light, and for two people who had once believed love no longer belonged to them, that was enough. It rained that evening, not the violent kind of rain that batters rooftops and rattles windows, but a soft, steady drizzle that soaked the city in silver and softened its sharpest edges. The streets glistened like mirrors, blurring headlights into halos, and high above it all, in the penthouse of WhiteTech Tower, a quiet storm brewed that had nothing to do with weather. Susan stood at the threshold of Richard's home, her coat still clinging to her shoulders, her hair damp, and her curls loose around her temples. Her boots made faint, wet prints on the marble floor. She had hesitated in the elevator. 3 times, she almost turned around. But something more profound than fear had pressed the button. Richard stood a few steps away, as if he didn't quite know what to do now that she was here. Neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, only fragile, like breath-fogging glass. He gestured toward the open living space, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the rain-swept skyline. Susan stepped inside, slow and cautious, her fingers brushing the fabric of her coat, as if unsure whether to shed it or keep it wrapped around her like armor. "This is," she began, searching for a word, but it didn't feel brilliant to comment on the luxury, space, and silence that felt almost sacred. "I know," Richard said gently, reading her hesitation. "It doesn't feel like a home." She looked at him. It feels like a place where someone forgot how to live. That made him smile softly, ruefully. You're not wrong. He walked to the window, and she followed. Together, they looked out at the city. The lights stretched forever, but neither of them was looking at the lights. Susan said, barely above a whisper, "You could have anyone." Richard turned to her. "That's not true." She met his gaze, uncertain. "I don't mean in theory," he added. "I mean, I've had people who wanted what I own, or what I could give, but no one's ever wanted to see me." Her breath hitched. "And you think I do?" she asked, not defensively, but earnestly. "I know you do," he said, "because when I'm around you, I stop performing, and I don't even notice it's happened." Susan looked away, blinking hard, her throat tight. He stepped closer. "Do you want to leave?" he asked. She shook her head. Slowly. No words. "Then stay," he said softly. And she did. He took her coat. Their fingers brushed. And just like that, something shifted. They didn't rush. He showed her his shelves, lined not with trophies or tech awards, but old books, many worn at the edges. She ran her fingers over a first edition of Baldwin. He poured her tea instead of wine. She laughed when he confessed he didn't know how to use the espresso machine, despite being imported from Italy. Time unfolded without fanfare, just warmth. And when she stood in the middle of his living room, looking so small against the towering windows, he walked toward her, slow, deliberate. She didn't back away, but she did speak first. "This doesn't change the world outside." "I know," he replied. "They'll talk, assume, judge. I know, and we'll both pay for it. I'm willing to," he said. Her eyes searched his face, not for charm or confidence, but for truth. When she found it, unvarnished and open, her body softened. "I've never—" she began, but the words failed her. Richard stepped closer, brushing a damp curl from her cheek. "You don't have to explain." She looked up at him. "But I want to." He waited. "I've never done this before. Not like this. Not when it means something." His breath caught, not from surprise, but reverence. "Then we go slow," he said. "We listen. We stop if you say stop. You lead. I follow." Her heart pounded. "I don't want to be careful tonight," she whispered. He stilled. "Are you sure?" "I'm tired of being afraid," she said. "Tired of holding my breath." And when he kissed her, it was not with hunger, but with awe. They moved together like people who knew what it meant to be broken, who knew what it cost to trust. Every button undone was a silent vow. Every touch was an answer to a question neither had dared to ask aloud. Susan's breath trembled as he lifted her into his arms. She didn't flinch. She didn't freeze. She let herself be, raw, open, honest. And Richard held her like something sacred. They moved through the spaces of the apartment like memory, not urgency. A trail of clothing, soft laughter, pauses between kisses where hands lingered, not to take, but to learn. In the bedroom, where moonlight bled through sheer curtains, they finally met without distance. No pretense, no status, no fear. When he touched her, it wasn't to possess, but to remember. When she let him in, it wasn't to please, but to feel. And after, when silence returned, and their breath slowed, and the world outside continued unaware, Susan lay with her head against his chest, listening to the heartbeat of a man who had once believed he'd never be whole again. He whispered, barely audible, "You don't know what you've given me." She pressed her lips to his skin and closed her eyes, And somewhere in the city below, beneath steel and judgment, a seed was planted. Not lust, not rescue, but something infinitely more dangerous. Hope. Morning came gently. No alarms. No meetings. No footsteps on polished floors. Just light, slipping like soft silk between the curtains of Richard's penthouse windows. It pooled over the hardwood, over a cast-off sweater, over the half-drunk cups of tea on the coffee table. It climbed slowly, curiously, until it reached the bed, where Susan lay in the crook of Richard's arm. She stirred first. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The sheets beneath her were too soft. The air is too still. The pillow smelled like bergamot and leather. And then, his arm. She turned her head. Richard was still asleep, or pretending to be. One hand rested against her spine, steady, warm. His breathing was even, and his lips parted slightly. He looked younger like this, with no suit to protect him, no title to carry, just a man, sleeping beside a woman who had never belonged in his world, until now. Susan didn't move. She let herself look at him, unguarded. She studied the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the small scar just above his brow, one he said he got when falling off a boat as a child. He had shared that story 2 weeks ago, over vending machine coffee, when they still spoke in half measures and passing glances. And now, this. Last night's warmth still lingered on her skin, but something else lingered too. Reality. The weight of it pressed against her ribs like an invisible hand. She sat up slowly, clutching the blanket to her chest. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the city below was already wide awake. Taxis, horns, emails, headlines, and judgment. Richard stirred then, eyes still closed, but sensing the shift. "Don't go," he murmured, voice husky with sleep. Susan turned to him. "I haven't moved." "Not yet," he said. "But your heart has." She exhaled a shaky breath. "I don't know how to do this, Richard. Wake up in your world. Walk out into mine." "You don't have to choose," he replied, slowly sitting beside her. "We'll make a new one." She smiled, sadly. "You say that like we have time. Like no one's watching." His hand found hers under the blanket. "Let them watch." "But they won't just watch," she said. "They'll rip us apart with words they've practiced on people like me their whole lives." Richard's jaw tightened. "Then let them try." There was silence again, but it didn't settle as easily this time. Susan pulled away gently and reached for her clothes. She dressed in the hush of his room, folding each movement into silence. "I have to get to work," she said, once she was fully dressed. He said, "You don't have to go back there." Rising too. "I can—" "No," she interrupted, not harshly, but firmly. "Don't make this about rescue." He paused, nodded. "I'm not ashamed of the floors I clean," she added. "How easily does the world decide who is worthy of being heard?" He walked to her, wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, and rested his chin on her shoulder. "Then let's make them listen." Her hand reached up to his, fingers lacing with his. "One day," she said, "but not today." And then, just before she left, she pressed her lips to his in a kiss that was more vow than farewell. Downstairs, Susan's world returned with brutal clarity. The janitor's locker room was loud with fluorescent lights and low conversation, but as soon as she stepped in, it all went quiet. Tanya stood by the mirror, applying lip gloss, watching Susan in the reflection. "You didn't clock in on time," she said. "Rough morning?" Susan didn't reply. Just placed her bag in her locker. Or was it a late night? Tanya added, her tone coated in sugar and venom. Susan turned, slowly. You have something to say, Tanya? Oh, not me. Tanya smiled. But the others, they're talking. Elevator cams don't lie, you know. Nor do the cameras in the lobby. Susan stilled. Her breath caught. What do you mean? Tanya leaned in. You're not a secret anymore. Upstairs, Richard sat in his office as Charles entered with a tablet. Page 6 got a tip, Charles said grimly. They're running a piece on you tomorrow. Unnamed source. But it's you. And her. Richard's eyes darkened. Shut it down. We tried. But they've got a photo. Charles turned the tablet toward him. The image glowed under the ceiling lights. It wasn't scandalous. It wasn't even dramatic. Just a candid frame. Susan and Richard standing in the garden. His coat draped over her shoulders. Their faces close, not quite touching. But the tenderness in that image spoke volumes. Richard's fingers curled into fists. We release a statement, Charles said cautiously. Get ahead of it. Say it's false. Or say it was misinterpreted. It's your choice. Richard didn't speak for a long time. Then he looked up. Calm, cold, certain. No lies, he said. If they will come for us, let them come for the truth. And far below, in a janitor's closet, Susan leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. For the first time since this began, her heart did not hum with poetry. It pounded with warning. The curtain between their worlds had lifted, and what waited beyond it was no longer whispers. It was war. It didn't take long for the story to bloom. By mid-morning, the internet had picked it up. First on gossip blogs, then across social media. Headlines flickered across screens with cruel elegance. Billionaire's hidden romance with night shift janitor revealed the cleaner and the CEO. A modern Cinderella or corporate scandal. Who is Susan Robinson? Susan's name was no longer just hers. It belonged to the world now, twisted and reshaped by clickbait, speculation, and anonymous judgment. She sat in the locker room holding her phone, fingers cold against the screen. There, beneath a photo she hadn't known was taken, was a comment section that felt like fire. This can't be real. She must have slept her way into that penthouse. Gold digger. Classic. Why him? She looks so plain. This is what happens when rich men get bored. She's playing the race card for sympathy. Just watch. Each word carved something out of her. The worst part wasn't the cruelty. It was how familiar the tone was. How quickly the world turned from curious to cruel when someone like her reached too far. Tanya passed behind her and said nothing, but Susan could feel the smirk in her footsteps. She didn't finish her shift. She couldn't. She left quietly through the back entrance without risking seeing Richard. Not yet. Not when her thoughts were spiraling into shame and anger and fear she didn't know how to hold. Richard tried to call. Once. Then twice. Then again. Each time, no answer. He sat in his office, staring at the tablet, the photo, the thousands of reactions. Charles walked in without knocking. I told you this would happen. You think I didn't know? Richard said, voice tight. This could cost you everything, Charles warned. Stockholders are already calling. Board members are whispering. They're calling it an abuse of power. I haven't abused anything. But perception doesn't care about nuance, Charles replied. It cares about optics, headlines, control. Richard stood slowly. I won't apologize for loving someone. Then you better be ready to bleed for it. The words echoed, but Richard didn't flinch. He wasn't the kind of man who bent to threat. But still, inside him, something ached, because while he was preparing to fight the world, Susan had gone quiet. She didn't go home. Susan was riding the train without direction, her eyes unfocused, and her coat pulled tightly around her frame like armor. The city blurred past her, station after station, life after life. When she finally got off, it was in Harlem, not far from where her mother used to take her to church, not far from where she'd once danced barefoot in the sprinklers with Jamal, back when summers felt eternal and her heart still knew how to trust. She stood beneath the old oak tree on 125th Street, where the wind smelled like roasted peanuts and rain-soaked brick. Her phone buzzed again. Richard. She let it ring. She wasn't angry at him. She was angry at the world that made her feel like she'd done something wrong by being wanted. She was angry that real, aching human love had to be justified if it didn't wear the right clothes or speak the proper names. But most of all, she was angry at how much she still wanted to answer, how much of her still ached for the sound of his voice. Hours passed. A bouquet sat at her door when she finally returned to her apartment. Not roses, not lilies. Lavender, wrapped in brown paper, with a single note. No headlines, no cameras. Just me, waiting. Susan held the lavender to her chest and closed her eyes. She thought of how the world tried to break women like her, with silence, with ridicule, with the lie that they were only worth what others decided. But then she thought of his hands, not how they held power, but how they had her, like something fragile, worthy, and seen. She picked up her phone and finally dialed. He answered on the first ring. "Susan," he breathed. "I didn't run," she said quietly. "I know. I just needed to remember who I was before they turned me into a headline." There was a pause. "And did you remember?" She smiled through the tears. "I remembered that I'm more than they'll ever understand." He exhaled, the sound almost breaking. "Then let them misunderstand as long as you remember. She didn't say I love you. Not yet." But in her silence, he heard the shape of it. And in his stillness, she knew. The world could try to bury them, but even beneath the rubble, they'd find each other again. The next morning, Susan stood in front of the mirror, her fingers trembling slightly as she twisted her curls into place. Each strand, each pin, each motion was a choice, a quiet defiance against the narrative others had tried to write for her. She wore a simple black blouse, no shimmer, no ornament. But when she looked at her reflection, she saw a woman finally remembering how to take up space. She left the lavender bouquet in water by her window, then stepped out into the morning sun, not with fear, but with quiet resolve. WhiteTech's lobby was louder than usual. Journalists lingered across the street, lenses poised. Employees whispered in huddles by the elevators. Security had doubled. But Susan walked past them all with her chin lifted and stride even. No hiding, not anymore. She made it to the elevator without incident, but just before the doors could close, a familiar voice interrupted. "Susan." Tanya stepped in. Her tone wasn't cruel this time, just curious, maybe even cautious. "You came back," she said. Susan turned to her calmly. "Didn't plan on disappearing." Tanya crossed her arms. "After all that noise online? I figured you'd be halfway to Georgia." "Running would have proved them right," Susan replied. "And I'm not theirs to define." There was a long pause. The elevator climbed. Floor numbers glowed in soft amber. Then Tanya said, "Quieter." "He chose you?" Susan met her eyes. "No, we chose each other." And for once, Tanya didn't smirk. She nodded and got off at her floor without another word. Upstairs, in the boardroom that overlooked half of Manhattan, Richard stood alone at the head of the table. The board members were filing in, Charles among them, tension clinging to the air like static. Some carried tablets, others printed reports. All carried assumptions. As the last member took their seat, Richard cleared his throat. I assume you've all seen the headlines. A few nods, a few uncomfortable shifts. Charles spoke first. We're here to discuss how to proceed, with discretion, with damage control. Richard smiled tightly. There will be no damage control. An older woman with silver hair raised a brow. Richard, public perception matters. Shareholders are concerned. I understand, which is why I'm going to be clear. He strolled to the front of the room. His voice didn't rise, but every word was thunder in silk. Susan Robinson is not a scandal. She is not a threat. And she is not your excuse to challenge my leadership. The room went still. I will not distance myself from someone because you're uncomfortable with what she represents. If the world thinks loving a black woman who happens to clean floors is a headline, then let them write it. But in this room, she will be treated with respect. Silence. Then Charles asked, carefully, Is this serious? Richard didn't hesitate. Yes. A beat passed. Then another. Until the silver-haired woman closed her folder and said, Then we'll adjust our expectations accordingly. And just like that, the storm began to shift. Not because they approved, but because they understood. Richard White had already made his choice. That evening, Susan returned to the garden. It wasn't planned. Her feet took her there, through instinct or longing. The same lavender bush trembled in the wind. The same flickering lamp cast its tired glow. She sat on the bench, her hands clasped in her lap. And not long after, he joined her. No words, just the comfort of two hearts, remembering how to rest beside each other. He handed her a small envelope. Inside was a newspaper clipping. Same photo, different headline. She changed his empire, not with power, but with presence. Susan's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. Who wrote this? A columnist who said she was tired of watching love be rewritten as scandal. Susan smiled, shaking her head softly. I'm still trying to understand what this means. Richard leaned closer, brushing his knuckles against hers. It means we stop hiding. That's all. She nodded. I spoke to the board today, he added. I told them everything. She turned sharply. Everything? Everything that matters, he said, that I choose you. Her voice was quieter than the breeze. Even if it costs you? I've made money, built towers, fought for empires. He looked at her, steady. But I've never fought for truth. Until now. She didn't speak, just laid her head against his shoulder. And as the garden faded into night, neither needed poetry or promises. They had presence. They had a choice. And for the first time, they had nothing left to hide. For the first time in weeks, Susan woke up to quiet. No headlines, no whispers outside her door. The soft rustle of wind through the curtains, and the pale morning sun resting against her cheek like a silent apology. She lay there for a while, curled beneath the sheets in Richard's bed, her cheek against his shoulder, his arm looped protectively around her waist. His breathing was steady, untroubled, for once. In that stillness, Susan let herself imagine. What if this were their life? Not stolen hours between rumors and shame, but a steady rhythm. Mornings like this, laughing over burnt toast and reading poems aloud. No longer being careful, just being, She lifted herself slowly, careful not to wake him. Her feet touched the floor. His shirt hung loosely from her shoulders, sleeves rolled to her elbows. She padded barefoot into the kitchen, thinking maybe, just maybe, she could make him coffee before he woke. The machine stared back at her like a stranger. Stainless steel. Too many buttons. She laughed softly, remembering the night he confessed he had no idea how to use it. Still, she tried. Fumbled. Frowned. Burned her fingertips slightly. "You're trying to impress me," a familiar voice said behind her, groggy and laced with affection. She turned. Richard leaned against the doorframe, hair tousled, eyes warm with sleep. No suit, no tie, just a man in love, watching the woman he adored try to belong in his world. "I was going to bring you coffee," she said. "I'm already awake. You've done more than enough." He walked toward her, wrapped his arms around her from behind, and kissed her neck. For a moment, nothing existed outside this apartment. Then his phone buzzed on the counter. Once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Richard pulled away, frowning. He checked the screen. A series of texts from Charles. "You need to call me, now. Someone's leaking documents." He called immediately. Charles picked up on the first ring. "What kind of documents?" Richard asked. "Internal emails, personal threads, even board correspondence. Stuff that could look bad, especially with the press still circling." Richard's voice lowered. "Are they real?" "Yes, but out of context, they could paint a different story." Richard's jaw clenched. "Where's the leak coming from?" "That's the thing," Charles said. "It traced the access point. It came from your apartment's network, your guest Wi-Fi." Silence. Then a colder voice from Richard. "What are you saying? You should ask who has accessed your private router in the past 72 hours. Susan didn't hear the conversation, but she saw his face when he turned around. The way his eyes darkened. The subtle tightening of his mouth. Not fear, calculation. "What's wrong?" she asked, already bracing for something unnamed. Richard hesitated. Then, slowly, he said, "Someone's leaked confidential data from my apartment." Her heart skipped. "I didn't," she began, but stopped when she saw his face shift again. Not in accusation, but in something even more challenging to bear. Doubt. Just for a second. A flicker. And then it was gone. "I didn't think it was you," he said quickly, stepping forward. "Susan, I know it wasn't you." But the damage had already crept between them. Not as suspicion. But I was hurt. She stepped back, her voice barely a whisper. "But you wondered, even if just for a second." "I didn't." "Yes, you did," she said. "And I get it. I'm the one who doesn't belong. I'm the only person in your life with more to prove than lose." He reached for her hand. "Susan, please. I've fought for you every step of the way." "I know," she whispered, voice trembling. "But fighting for me isn't the same as trusting me." He stilled. The truth of it hit too precisely. And then her phone vibrated. A new message. She picked it up. One unread text from an unknown number. "Careful who you sleep next to. Trust can be expensive." Photo attached. She opened it. It was a blurry image, taken from somewhere inside the apartment. A distant shot of her back as she stood by the window last night, framed in silhouette. Completely unaware she was being watched. Her blood turned to ice. Richard read the message over her shoulder. His face drained of color. "Someone was inside," he said. "This isn't just about leaks. This is personal." Susan couldn't speak. couldn't move. Someone had been close enough to watch her, photograph her. From inside a place she thought was safe, she turned to Richard. Who would do this? His voice was steel. Someone who doesn't just want to ruin me. They want to destroy us. Later that day, after the apartment had been swept for surveillance and the IT team began investigating devices with renewed urgency, Susan sat curled up on the far edge of Richard's couch, knees drawn to her chest. He brought her tea. She barely touched it. He sat beside her, but she didn't lean into him. The distance between them had changed shape. No longer fear, not even shame, but fragility. I'm sorry, he said finally. She looked at him. For what? Never letting the world come between what I feel for you and what I know about you. Her eyes welled, but no tears fell. It wasn't your fault, she said. It was mine too. I let my old fears walk in the door before I did. He reached for her hand. I've had board members try to steal this company. Investors threatened to pull out. But I've never been more afraid than I was this morning, when I thought I might have lost your trust. Her hand tightened slightly in his. I wanted to believe we were stronger than this, she whispered. We are, he said. But hope, she said, is a fragile thing when you're used to people leaving. I'm not leaving. And this time, when he said it, there was no flicker of doubt, no pause, only conviction. She leaned into him, slowly, carefully, and somewhere deep in the city's heart, beneath towers of steel and glass, love, battered and tested, took one more breath, still standing, still burning, still theirs. The rain came in sheets that morning, as though the city had decided to mourn. Susan stood by the window of Richard's office, watching droplets race down the glass like tears on cold skin. The skyline was cloaked in fog. Even the spire of the Chrysler building looked hesitant to show itself. She hadn't spoken much since the photograph. There was something about being watched, violated, that clawed at her more deeply than gossip or headlines ever could. It wasn't just fear. It was a betrayal, and it lived beneath her skin like an echo. Richard stood at his desk, jaw tight as he scanned the lines of encrypted security reports. Whoever did this, he said quietly, knew my schedule, knew when we were here, knew how to avoid the hallway cameras. Susan turned toward him, folding her arms over her chest. So, it was someone inside. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Then Charles entered, face pale and stormy. We found the breach. Richard's gaze snapped up. Charles handed him a folder. Access logs, Wi-Fi connections, keycard usage, and this. He pulled out a screenshot. A direct email thread between Tanya Hale, janitorial supervisor, and a freelance media outlet notorious for scandals, leaks, and tabloid exposés. Attached to the email, the same photo of Susan by the window. Richard's silence was more terrifying than a scream. Charles whispered, She sold the image. And she's the one who used your guest Wi-Fi to access your internal files. She was digging for weeks. Susan didn't speak, but her stomach turned with something cold and awful. She's been working here for over a decade, Susan said quietly. She's cleaned these halls longer than I've been in this city. Charles nodded grimly, and she resented every second of it. Richard looked at Susan. I'll have her arrested. No, Susan said sharply. He blinked. What? Let her go, she said. But don't feed her story. Please don't give her a courtroom to spin this into something it's not. Richard hesitated, then nodded once. Termination. Effective immediately. Her name will never cross this building's lips again. Charles left to carry out the order. silence settled, and still, the rain did not stop. Later that evening, Susan returned to her apartment alone. She needed space, not from Richard, but from everything else. From polished floors and penthouse views, from security sweeps and boardroom tension. She needed something small, something hers. But when she opened the door, she wasn't alone. Jamal stood in the hallway, shoulders damp with rain, hands shoved into the pockets of a faded bomber jacket. Her little brother. Except he wasn't little anymore. Not the boy she'd once shielded from fights or soothed after nightmares. He was a man now, bitter, bruised by life, and tall in a way that made her ache with memories. "Been a while," he said. Susan's voice caught. "Jamal, what are you doing here?" "I saw your name online," he replied. "Hard to miss when it's plastered everywhere like you're the new Meghan Markle." She winced. "Don't start." "Too late," he said. "The family's talking, Sue. Aunt Myra called me crying. Said you're playing house with a billionaire while we rot in the same place you left us in." Susan stepped inside, motioning him in only after a long pause. He followed, dripping onto the tile like a storm brought indoors. "She said I didn't leave anyone," placing her bag on the table. "I sent money every month. I paid your court fees. I kept the lights on in Mama's house until the day she—" He cut her off. "You think that's love? Wires and bills? Did you replace them showing up?" She turned. "I did what I could, Jamal." "Yeah?" he sneered. "And now you've got a new family, one with penthouses and headlines." Her voice broke. "Don't do this." He stared at her for a long moment. Then something softened. "Just barely. I came here to warn you," he muttered. "Not just to yell." Susan blinked. "Warn me?" "I heard something," he said, "from someone who knows people." "That leak? The photos?" Tanya didn't work alone. Someone paid her. Someone big. A name with real money. Susan felt the room tilt slightly. "Why?" Jamal shrugged. "Because taking down Richard White takes more than numbers. It takes a scandal. And you're the crack in his armor." She swallowed hard. But why would someone want to ruin him like that? Jamal's gaze darkened. "You forget where you are. Love is fine when it follows rules. But yours doesn't. It threatens people. People who hide behind charity galas and champagne donations, but choke on the idea of a black woman sitting in the same room as them. Want." Susan leaned against the counter. "You always said I was the strong one," Jamal added. "But I think you've been holding up the sky alone for too damn long." He walked to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You good?" he asked, in the way only a brother could. "I will be," she whispered. And for the first time in years, they hugged. Not perfect, not without pain, but real. Later that night, Susan returned to the garden. Richard was already there. Rain had stopped. The stone bench was damp, but he stood beside it, coat draped over one arm. Their eyes met in the soft glow of the lamp. "Tanya wasn't alone," she said. He nodded once. "I figured. Someone paid her. Someone who sees me as a threat." "No," he said gently. "Someone who sees you as proof." "Proof of what?" "That love can't be bought, D or K, inside neat little boxes." She stepped closer. "You still want this?" she asked. "More than anything," he replied. She touched his face, and beneath the bruises of betrayal, they stood, tired, tested, unbroken. Some knives wear familiar faces. Some wounds don't bleed. But some loves, when tested, only deepen their roots. The invitation arrived 3 days later, embossed, heavy, gilded with delicate silver trim. The annual Harrington Foundation Gala, New York's most glittering, brutal social event. A place where fortunes mingled with gossip, and reputations were either cemented or shattered. Richard received it every year. He never once cared to go, but this year, he had a reason. Susan said they'll wait for us, reading the sponsors' names aloud. Every camera, every whisper. I know, Richard replied, fastening his cufflinks. And you still want to walk into that room with me? He turned to her, his voice quiet, steady, especially with you. But Susan wasn't so sure. It wasn't about fear. Not anymore. It was about memory. Rooms like that had always tried to swallow her whole, with tight smiles and lingering glances, with questions wrapped in compliments, with invisible signs that read, "You don't belong here." She had been taught, gently and not so gently, to shrink herself in spaces like those, to be pleasant, silent, impressive, but never too bold, beautiful, but never noticed. So when the black gown arrived, tailored to her frame, smooth as melted onyx, she hesitated before putting it on. Not because she doubted herself, but because part of her had never dared to imagine she'd walk through that kind of door as herself. The gala was held at the Metropolitan Club, where every chandelier was a history lesson and every stairwell a whispered threat. The carpet was blood red, the ceilings are gilded. Servers moved like shadows, and every guest turned like flowers to light when Richard White entered the room. But tonight, they didn't look at him. They looked at her. Susan Robinson. Tall, elegant, skin glowing like carved mahogany under the crystal lights. Her curls were pinned back with tiny pearls. No diamonds, no borrowed tiara. Just grace, and the courage it took to carry herself without apology. A silence followed them, the kind that feels velvet on the surface, but cuts beneath. Women glanced, then glanced again. Men stared longer than they should. And somewhere, behind a curtain of champagne and cello music, a story was being rewritten without her permission. But Susan kept walking, not because she was unafraid, but because fear had never been reason enough to turn back. Midway through the evening, the host took the stage. There was polite applause, a speech, another round of champagne. Then came the highlight, the annual Philanthropic Recognition Award. To Richard White, the host announced, for his contributions to sustainable tech, educational programs, and, most recently, his commitment to inclusive hiring practices. Applause again. But this time, it was sharper, measured. And as Richard stepped forward, Susan remained seated, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Then the host added, almost as an afterthought, "And a warm welcome to his guest this evening, Ms. Susan Robinson." There it was, not a partner, not a companion, not even a colleague, just guest, as if her presence needed softening, as if she were an intermission before the real show continued. She felt the room shift, not loudly, not rudely, but definitely. Even when Richard returned to her side, she could sense it, the invisible wall they'd built around her. One smile at a time. An hour later, she stood on the balcony, arms resting on the stone balustrade, city lights winking far below. The noise of the gala drifted behind her. Soft laughter, clinking glasses, the distant ache of a violin. Richard found her there. "They can't see you," he said quietly. Not really. But that doesn't make you invisible. Susan looked down at her hands. I could do this. You are doing it. She turned to him. But every time I walk into rooms like this, I feel like I've borrowed a version of myself, one who wears silence better than truth. He stepped closer. And what's the truth? She swallowed. That I don't want to be tolerated, Richard. I want to be seen. Not as a symbol, not as a statement, just as a woman who loves, who works, who matters. His voice was barely a whisper. Then let me see you. She looked up, and in his eyes there was no noise, no pretense, no performance, only the kind of quiet that comes after a long storm. I was afraid, she said, voice trembling. I'd lose something if I stood beside you in front of them. What? He asked gently. Myself. He reached out, brushing his fingers against her cheek. What if standing beside me is how you finally reclaim yourself? She stared at him. This man who'd built empires and still reached for her, like she was the most fragile, most worthy thing in the room. I love you, she said finally. The words didn't burst out. They unfolded. He smiled. I've loved you since you first refused to laugh at my terrible coffee. She laughed softly. Come inside, he said. Do we have to? No, he said. But we can because we've stopped hiding. She took his hand. And when they walked back into the ballroom, something strange happened. Some heads still turned. Some whispers still followed, but Susan no longer heard them. Because the only thing louder than judgment was her choice to stay. And that was louder than any chandelier crash, headline scream, or gala murmur. She didn't just survive the room. She changed it. Spring arrived quietly in New York that year. No grand parade, no theatrical bloom, just small, almost invisible shifts, buds appearing on trees bare for months, a warmth creeping into the morning air, light lingering a little longer on rooftops. Susan sat on the steps of the brownstone she and Richard had moved into just a few weeks ago. Not the penthouse, not the glass tower that had once belonged more to power than to peace. This home had creaky floorboards and ivy around the window panes. The front door stuck when it rained. Out back, the garden had only 3 tulips, stubbornly blooming in crooked directions. But it was theirs. Inside, Richard was somewhere between unboxing books and burning toast. She could hear him mumbling to himself about mislabeled boxes and missing mugs. She smiled, sipping her tea. How strange, she thought, that the life she once feared would never be hers had become something as simple, as extraordinary, as this. No photographers, no statements, no eyes that judged before they saw. Just mornings, just choices, just them. It hadn't come easily. There were weeks of rebuilding, of meeting with lawyers to handle what Tanya had left behind, of confronting the man behind the manipulation, a rival tech executive who saw Richard's relationship as a weakness to exploit and Susan's presence as a liability. But together, they fought, not just to clear reputations, but to protect something softer, something more vital than pride, their truth. And truth, when fought for fiercely enough, starts to echo. Soon, the narrative shifted. Not entirely, not perfectly, but it shifted. The media moved on. Whispers dulled. Their story didn't end with a scandal. It grew roots in something more substantial than public approval. Richard came outside with a blanket and a burnt slice of toast. She took it anyway. He sat beside her, blanket over both their laps. They watched the street in comfortable silence, neighbors walking dogs, kids on scooters, the bakery lifting its shutters for the day. He nudged her shoulder. Thinking again? Always. Worried? She shook her head. No. Just remembering. He looked at her, that same gaze that had once stopped her breath in a sterile elevator all those months ago. You know, he said, if someone had told me the woman scrubbing coffee stains from my office floor would one day teach me more about integrity than a room full of billionaires. She raised an eyebrow. I hope you paid that woman well. He laughed. She's got the deed to my heart. That's got to be worth something. She rested her head on his shoulder. You're insufferable. And in love, he added. There was a pause. She whispered, Me too. In the months that followed, they did not become perfect. They argued over grocery lists and disagreed on paint colors. They learned each other's silences. They healed from old scars in strange, patient ways. But in all things, they chose each other, day after day, word after word. And when asked how they made it work, they never gave the same answer. Because love, when it's real, isn't a formula. It's a fight, a risk, a promise, whispered in dark corners and shouted across glittering ballrooms. It's walking through doors you were never meant to enter and holding your head high anyway. Susan looked at Richard now, tracing the lines of his face. So, she said, what happens next? He smiled. We live. And if the world starts watching again? Let them, he said. We're not a story anymore. We're alive. Jump. And to you, reading this, maybe you've loved someone the world said you weren't supposed to. Maybe you've walked into rooms that made you feel small. Maybe you've questioned your worth in a mirror that didn't know your name. But hear this. You are not too much. You are not too little. You are not misplaced. And the kind of love that sees all of you, that fights for your light, even in the darkest rooms, isn't a fairy tale. It's possible. It's real. Just like Susan and Richard. And if this story stirred something in you, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us your truth, your moment, your fire. And don't forget to like, follow, and stay close. Because love stories like this aren't written just once. They're rewritten every day. By people like you. People who believe, despite everything, that love always finds its way home.